Video games. During this interesting time while we're in our COVID-proof war bunkers, this medium has been a constant source of escapism and immersion, for either when we're all bored, stressed, procrastinating, or possibly a combination of all three. Now imagine all that shit you love about video games, but better. That's the general idea video game developers and publishers have when it comes to either remastering or remaking a classic title from a previous generation, or simply bringing a game to newer platforms altogether. Now, I realize I'm far from the first person to do a video on this kind of topic, but this is less about what goes into the process or whether it's even worth it to pursue such endeavors in the first place. This is more about how the advent of video game remasters and remakes have affected my personal favorite franchises. So grab your popcorn, a Diet Pepsi, and your DVD copy of Shrek 2 you probably keep under your pillow for good luck, cause this one's a fucking biggie. Well, I suppose since this one's rather recent, we can talk about it. The original Demon's Souls, while far from my favorite Souls game or even a Souls-like in general, I had a lot to offer in terms of a refreshing aesthetic for JRPGs at the time, and a more classical sense of storytelling that harkened back to the NES and Super Nintendo days when story was of very little importance to a game, and instead the world was fleshed out visually through how enemies looked, behaved, how environments looked, or the diversity in different boss characters. Although the game itself also had optional lore you could read up on by examining items or different background details in a level. While it is a bit of a gem in the PS3 library given it's the very first Souls game ever made, and it's nice to see the progenitor of what Miyazaki would eventually do with the formula, it also has no problem of reminding you that, well, it's the very first Souls game. You can only roll in 4 directions. Certain areas like the Rotting Haven where you fight the Dirty Colossus suffer from piss-poor draw distance or a lack of actual lighting that lets you see where you're going. Bosses like the Vanguard and the Flame Lurker look like literal walking turds of shit. The UI is significantly more complicated than the following Dark Souls games to navigate. The old Dragon God still requires like 400 fucking arrows to even have a chance of defeating it. And yes, as the great donkey has preached to us mere mortals, Firestorm absolutely fucking snaps the difficulty in half, even more than adding a first-person aiming to Metal Gear Solid did. But we'll get to that later, okay? Flash forward to today, where out of nowhere, the remake gods at Bluepoint Games have come up with a from-the-ground-up remake of Demon's Souls as a launch title for that shiny new PlayStation 5. And they went all fucking out for this one. Bluepoint tends to use the original games as a starting point, but they've cleaned this one the fuck up, as well as generally adding quality of life improvements to bring it more in line with the Dark Souls games, such as having it so you can use Arc Stones at like Dark Souls bonfires so you don't have to return to the Nexus Hub to reset enemy positions, streamlining the UI to be easier to navigate, extra weapons, and a redone world tendency system that allows up to 6 players to interact with each other at once, a character customization system that's way more in-depth, but most importantly, the graphical glow-up of the century! God damn! This game makes quite the fucking statement as a launch game for a next-gen console. Everything looks so much more depressing and dour, and that's exactly how I like it. But let's talk about the soundtrack. They brought in a whole ass orchestra to rearrange and reimagine the original soundtrack, composed by Shunsuke Hida, and the result is questionable. Look, I really get what they were trying to do, you know. Let's make Demon's Souls sound more like Dark Souls or Bloodborne. But here's the problem, you know. Come here, Jimbo. I'm about to blow your mind with this shit. Come here. Demon's Souls is Demon's Souls, and Dark Souls is Dark Souls. And the two just don't connect, other than having souls in their names. Literally, souls are the only thing that remotely connect these Souls games. So instead of the somber and melancholic tone of the original game's compositions, whose almost intentionally awkward instrumentations contribute to how confused and abstract every boss you encounter will feel, every song is just trying to be Dark Souls 3. They totally butchered Tower Knight's theme and you know it. And speaking of remakes that have made creative decisions that left the fanbase super divided and unsure as to whether it succeeded as either a modern update or a good reimagining of a beloved game, Metal Gear Solid! Metal Gear is my personal favorite non-RPG series of all time, and Metal Gear Solid in particular was obviously a pretty fucking big deal when it came out. It was the first major mainstream example of a video game that attempted to replicate movie-like qualities such as cutscenes with lots of exposition-based dialogue, either to advance the plot or advance character development, a deep and complex story that touched on subliminal messaging that reflected the world's state during that particular point in time, touching on topics other games at the time didn't even touch with a 10-foot pole, such as nuclear war, acts of terrorism, and even suicidal ideations, government falsifications, and anxieties of particular characters. Intense camera work that accentuated the sense of dreariness and claustrophobia when traversing the industrial interiors of the Shadow Moses facility, and one of the most iconic and timeless supporting casts in all of gaming. Flash forward to 2004, and Konami, in collaboration with Nintendo and Silicon Knights of Eternal Darkness fame, released Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes, a remake exclusive to the gaming lunchbox itself, the Nintendo GameCube. Not only was the PS1 game given an incredible graphical facelift just to match the fidelity recently shown off in Metal Gear Solid 2 on PS2, but the entire original voice cast was brought back to re-record the enormous script, including some new dialogue and revised dialogue from the original. In addition to this, the gameplay, while largely remaining faithful to the original game, added major mechanics that were first introduced in MGS2, such as first-person aiming, tranquilizer weapons to subdue enemies, using lockers as either hiding spots or for hiding unconscious or deceased bodies of genome soldiers, and hanging onto ledges as a traversal mechanic. Now all of this sounds great on paper, right? You bring the game to an, at the time, current-gen platform, update the gameplay and presentation to bring it more in line with the latest game at the time, and re-record all the dialogue to make sure you can't hear a CSGO surf session going on in the background while David Hayter is questioning absolutely everything ever. But hey, we can't all have nice things, right? Firstly, I did hint at this earlier, but yes, adding MGS2's gameplay mechanics to MGS1's largely unchanged framework and level design without slightly redesigning the game to accommodate for these updates does indeed snap the difficulty in half in a lot of instances. While a lot of the design decisions made for MGS1 in the first place were a result of the technical constraints of the PlayStation's hardware, stuff like not being able to move in first-person mode, or having a limited line of sight in regards to spawning enemies ahead of you, or having to backtrack and front-track multiple times to change the temperature of the keycard after Meryl gets shot by Sniper Wolf, they added to the industrial and foreboding sense of peril and dread that permeated throughout the atmosphere of the original game. In that, in actuality, you were every bit as vulnerable as your enemies, and that by procuring more equipment as the game progressed, and as you gained more health by defeating each boss, you progressively grew into being the badass clone of the world's most legendary soldier you were always meant to be. However, the Twin Snakes kinda just gives you all that power from the start, and while the addition of these mechanics is definitely a welcome way to modernize the game and bring it closer to Sons of Liberty mechanically, there are just more than a few instances where you can feel like all the vulnerability you used to feel that made things way more rewarding when you got accustomed to the systems originally just isn't there anymore. Case in point, fights like Vulcan Raven and Revolver Ocelot, which used to be these tense cat and mouse chases that made excellent use of both stealth and shooting, are pretty much rendered moot when you can just stand there and aim at them from any single position on the map, and if they happen to get you down hard enough on health, you can just pump yourself with rations and be good to go. All of these quirks are even further accentuated with the damage multipliers you get now when performing perfect headshots on boss characters. But let's talk about the Matrix-sized elephant in the room, the newly directed story cutscenes, as well as the general retooling of the game's atmosphere. Filmmaker Ryu Kitamura was hired to direct the in-game cutscenes and cinematics in-house at Konami, while the team at Silicon Knights was busy finishing the main game. And while he originally set out to direct the story cutscenes in a way that remained very true and respectful towards the original game, Kojima stepped in at the very last minute and basically said, "Yo, I just got finished watching this transcendent filmic experience called The One with Jet Li. Do you mind putting some of that in my Metal Gear Solid?" And he basically said, Finally, I can release myself. Dark, atmospheric, immersive, tense, unsettling, foreboding, unexpected. You see, this scene is very straightforward. It's straight to the point, you know? It looks like the villains emerge victorious, and then he gets hit with the missiles from Snake, you know, doing the power play. You know, he just stands there and shoots missiles. He doesn't really do anything stupid like jumping off of an active missile to shoot another missile at the high D, you know? It's very straightforward. Then it pans to him, you know, he looks at the flames, he says his cool action movie catchphrase, all willy-nilly, no fluff.
That takes care of the cremation. Sarani, このブラストアームを発射。ロケットパンチ。
A classic villain introduction, you know? It gives you a sense of the personality of the villains in this game, given that this is the very first boss you face and he's, you know, twirling his gun like he's all show-offy and stuff like that. Nothing too special.
So you're the one that the boss keeps talking about. And you? Special Operations Foxhound. Revolver.
I'm pretty sure I can make a whole ass brownie in the amount of time it takes for this guy to spin this gun. In fact, let's try that out. Okay guys, it's brownie time, bitches. Let's begin. What? All in all, I may make fun of how Twin Snakes is, as do a lot of people, but truth be told, it isn't really a bad game by any stretch of the imagination. It was remaking a game I'd already consider among my top 10 PS1 games ever made, in addition to being another example of Nintendo desperately trying to court third parties for some real good shit on the GameCube after the N64. It's a really solid game and definitely one of those hidden gems in the GameCube library, which signified both Metal Gear's graphical and expressive evolution, as well as the series' turn towards more stylized cinematography and storytelling that would be fully delved into by the time we get to Snake Eater, which would only come out a few months later. It was also a pretty big step forward for Nintendo themselves in their pursuit towards more mature content on their consoles in order to break away from the perception that all they were good for was red-hatted plumbers, elf shit, and a blob with stubs for hands that wakes up in the morning for their daily god-destroying workout regime. That's not to say they broke off from that perception completely for long though.
Woshi. It's a double Yoshi explosion.
It's far from what I'd consider the quote-unquote way Metal Gear Solid was meant to be played, but it's definitely a sound reimagining of a game that was widely regarded as a seminal classic back in the day. Also, it gave Snake the pass to appear in a game where he chokes out a Yoshi about 4 years later, and I'll be forever grateful for that. Did you know that Snake's Smash inclusion came complete with MGS4 tie-ins ahead of that game's release? Yeah, they actually put in a rearrangement of the theme of love and some cameos from the Gecko units on the Shadow Moses Island stage well before MGS4 even came out. Not on the Wii though. That's pretty interesting. It's highly unlikely at this point that Twin Snakes will ever be re-released in any capacity because the game's rights are tied up between Nintendo and Konami due to Nintendo sharing a production credit on the game and Miyamoto producing it in particular. And you know, one company made Mario Tennis Ultra Smash and the other made Contra Hard Corpse, which looks more like a deceased corpse if anything. So yeah, don't get your hopes up. But you know, if they ported the HD collection to the Switch with Twin Snakes as a Nintendo exclusive game, I'd be down for it. On that note, let's talk about remasters. Remasters and enhanced ports naturally take way less work than remaking a game from scratch, as instead of starting from square one with a pre-existing game as a reference point, they take that exact original game and use it as a base to add more shit in order to make it a more content-rich product. This could be anything from enhanced visuals or graphics, or in the case of remasters, general quality of life improvements to gameplay, or even entirely new story scenarios or even playable characters not present in the original game. It also gives developers an excuse to make unnecessarily additive or long titles, or redoing Catherine's logo so it takes the shape of a woman's panties. And that's pretty funny. Why play Dragon Quest XI when you can play the naturally superior version, Dragon Quest XI S Echoes of an Elusive Age Definitive Edition Turbo HD Remix Maniac's Chronicle? Part of that title was real. And I'm not telling you which one. Remasters and enhanced ports can have varying levels of quality in the end. For every Last of Us Remastered or Baldur's Gate 2 Enhanced Edition, there's a Silent Hill HD collection or... Fuck man, that looks demastered if anything. And for every Persona 5 Royal or Devil May Cry 3 Special Edition, there's a Final Fantasy VI on mobile and Steam, where these upscaled sprites for Locke, Cyan, and Setzer make them look like they all have giant tits that thrust through their clothes despite the fact that they're all men. The best remasters clean up the graphics just enough so they look no more timeless and aged presentation-wise. The perfect remasters also add a lot of quality of life improvements that generally elevate the gameplay from a stage where it might have been considered archaic by modern standards to addressing complaints players had towards gameplay mechanics or a game's presentation, basically inching that game closer to perfection, or turning a once flawed game into a more playable experience you can actually enjoy. But what of the reimagining? This type of remake essentially uses the original game's narrative as a base while creating an entirely new experience out of it. These kinds of remakes typically use completely new gameplay systems, level design, and even added story and characters that go beyond just remaking a game and essentially trying to completely modernize it in an attempt to bring it in line with other modern titles, specifically those in the same series. The two major examples of how to do this kind of remake right are Resident Evil 2 and Final Fantasy VII Remake. Resident Evil 2 is pretty much a completely new game from the ground up. Calling it a remake is being very, very polite. It follows the same general narrative, incorporating the two sides of the plot you get to experience through the perspectives of both Leon Kennedy, he kinda looks like 90s Leonardo DiCaprio, I'm not the only person who sees that, right? And Claire Redfield, who only exists to get overshadowed by Ada Wong's fashion sense. This remake switches the camera to be over the shoulder in a similar vein to Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6, completely reworking the shooting and inventory mechanics with a more in-depth crafting system that honestly gives me Last of Us vibes the more I think about it. And Mr. X gon' give it to you can now enter all rooms you're in, including the typewriter rooms where you save your game. Shit! Final Fantasy VII Remake is a remake of Final Fantasy VII. I think. Now you have to have known the demand for this particular game. At E3 in 2005, Square Enix showed off a tech demo presenting the opening of Final Fantasy VII running on the Crystal Tools engine being used for Final Fantasy XIII, and a tutorial on how to come back from the dead on the PS3. People lost their fucking mind watching this presentation, realizing that, whoa, wait, Square could potentially be planning a remake of Final Fantasy VII on the PS3. All they got was disappointment. Nah, we'd have to wait another generation for this faded reimagining of an RPG classic. Now I will be the first to admit, Final Fantasy VII is not my favorite numbered game in the series. That would have to go to 6. And even then I was always more of a tactics guy, but I'll be damned if I didn't want to join in on the hype for this game. The best part is that this game actually turned out to be not terrible. As in, it actually ended up being one of my favorite games of the entire year next to Ghost of Tsushima, Persona 5 Royal, and Xenoblade on Switch. Yeah, it's pretty good. Like with Resident Evil 2, the remake moniker might be a little too superfluous on this particular title. I don't really like to look at Final Fantasy VII Remake as a remake, but rather a new take on Final Fantasy VII. I like to imagine that this is what Final Fantasy VII would look like in a post-Final Fantasy XIII world, when the series had already taken its turn into more stylized and flamboyant gameplay and production value. If Final Fantasy VII was released as a product in modern day, as if the Final Fantasy series was already taking cues from the Kingdom Hearts series without the advent of more experimental titles like Final Fantasy XII, XIII, and XV, this is what that game would look like. The gameplay is drastically overhauled. Gone is the active time battle system of old, and instead things are taken in a more action-oriented direction with a proper real-time system where the time meter waits for no man. Unless you enable classic mode. The story feels denser. One of my personal biggest complaints with the original game was that aside from Cloud and Aerith, I didn't really care for much of the wider cast. Tifa's only excuses for not trying to break through to Cloud during his PTSD Mako-infused delusions was not wanting to hurt him. Sid swears up and down and verbally harasses his assistant even after saving his damn life because god damn it, I want to go to fucking space! And Barrett is what Japanese people think black people sound like. And pretty much any emotional arc he goes through stops after the events in Mount Coral where you kill Dine and learn about the incident where he lost his arm. Red 13's sole progression in character was that he found out his father wasn't a complete pussy. And Kate Sith is like Revolver Ocelot if he was both unsubtle and pitifully pathetic at manipulating people. These characters become more fleshed out and expanded upon thanks to this. But in the context of the original game, none of the arcs were particularly satisfying either in writing or execution with the exceptions of Cloud and Aerith, in my opinion. But I'll be damned if this wasn't addressed wholly in Remake story for the most part. I love these new depictions of the characters. I'm of the opinion that the way certain characters, particularly Cloud, were treated in all the multimedia stuff following Final Fantasy VII has shaped the perception towards certain members of the cast from those who haven't necessarily played the original game, particularly how they're depicted in stuff like the Kingdom Hearts games and Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, the movie. The remake does a much better job at not just remaining faithful to their personalities, but expanding on their emotional core, which makes the narrative feel more tightly written and well-paced, even if things are a bit slow to start. A lot of people were doubting the developer's abilities to turn Midgar, which usually took around 6 hours to escape from in the original game, into holy shit! But they managed to remain faithful to the original, while expanding on the characters' personalities, and even implementing new scenarios that play on the original game's strength of advancing character development without necessarily advancing the plot itself. I always like it when games, especially RPGs, just have scenes where the characters talk and converse about things that aren't necessarily the immediate story, and it gives them some weight and humanity behind the words that they're saying and allows for more deep interactions that increases their likability and relatability, which is what a lot of the best JRPGs are capable of. The combat is another major high point. I felt that the last time they tried to interpret real-time Final Fantasy combat in 15, it just didn't work. It felt like the flow of combat just amounted to mashing the melee buttons and parrying, and not once did I find myself relying on spells or really anything from my inventory besides having to manually heal my whole team all the time because Prompto, can you actually do something useful, you son of a bitch? Remake, by comparison, does boil down to having your standard light and heavy attack system, but the element of strategy present in turn-based Final Fantasy I felt was missing in 15 was a big focus of how the combat in the game worked. There's nothing more satisfying than getting a perfect parry off of an an enemy or boss, triggering the stagger status effect and just wailing on them, but I also found myself using the spells a lot more often. One thing in particular I felt would happen as a result of the change in combat perspective was that the materia system would be de-emphasized, since the game being an action RPG might take away from the strategy introduced by how uniquely customizable materia was in the original game, in regards to the different attributes and how it changed how party members behaved in battle. But to my surprise, the integration of it is what kept the battles from ever getting boring or repetitive, and the summon materia in particular is just fucking gorgeous to look at, honestly. So yeah, it's a good game, and you should play it. What, you don't have a PS4? Well, what are you doing? Literally everyone, their mom and their fetus owns one, so you're slacking by comparison. Turn over your gamer badge immediately. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is, it's harder to revisit an older game than it might seem at first glance. Sometimes what you made the first time, whether it be art, a book you wrote, or a movie or game you made, is so good that they can be left untouched and still hold up. Other times you feel the experience can be added onto to make it better. And sometimes you say fuck it and start from square one and make the same game in a completely new style or engine. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that new funky mode totally justifies Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze being re-released at full price. I would totally pay 80 Canadian dollars plus tax for this. Thank you, Nintendo, I love you.